Hi, this is Mark Millian for CompuMove Systems, and today we're going to look at vendor payables. We're going to do a simple vendor payable for a truck repair, and we're going to do a more complicated payable where we split the allocation, and we'll use a truck rental for that example. So here on the CompuMove toolbar, I'm going to click Financial System and then Vendor Bills. I land on the vendor group area, so I'll pick the vendor's vendor group. And then within that, I'm going to choose Bob's Truck Repair as my vendor. And then I land in the amount in the field for the payable amount. So I'm going to say in this example a $250 invoice. When I select the invoice field and move on from it, up comes the due date function. So this is the day that the vendor wishes to be paid, or at the very least the day that I wish to pay the vendor. So I'll go ahead and pick an appropriate date there. And that brings me to the field for the description for this vendor item. If I've used this vendor before, I can hit the last vendor description button and it'll repeat it. Otherwise, I can go to the vendor history and look there, or I can just come into this description and do whatever I want to. So why don't I say truck expense, brakes, unit 17, just to give myself a little bit of an embellished description. If I've got an invoice number from this vendor, I can enter it. It'll defend me against duplicate invoice numbers, should that be an issue. There's a whole function also to keep track of invoice notes. So if I want to make a more elaborate note, or I want to paste some information into this related to this invoice, I can do that, and that'll be accessible later for review. There's also a function to set the posting date back. So if I'm making an after-the-fact entry, I can do that and have it land on my general ledger at some point in the past. So now I've defined my vendor item, the group, the vendor, the amount, the due date, the description, their invoice number. Now I need to allocate it, tell the system what this was for. So in this case, this is a straight expense, so I'm going to allocate to GL accounts. I click there. It lands on a predefined general ledger expense account. There's a whole array of expense accounts, of course. When you set up a vendor or use a vendor for the first time, it'll settle on an account which you can then move off of with later transactions, but that'll become your default. When I'm looking at making a new item here, I can do repeat description, and it will paste in the description that I entered when I set the payable up. I can also see the history of the existing items in the lower half of the screen. So if I'm making an adjustment to an allocation or just want to review the history, that's going to appear there. In this case, I'm not doing that, so I'm just going to hit the New Item button. And that brings me back to the main posting setup screen. And now I've got a transaction that's ready to post. So I've got a payable entered, I've got a due date, I've got an allocation to an expense account, and I'm ready to go. So I'm going to say post as payable, and the transaction processes. And now it offers, because it thinks perhaps I'm sitting in front of a stack of bills, it offers to do another transaction. If I'm working with another invoice from the same vendor, I can do that. But let's move on and pick a different vendor. So I'm going to click on Do Another, New Vendor, and up comes my vendor list. And now I'm going to say Rider Truck Rental. And let me put $1,500 in here, and let's pick a due date a little further forward. And now I'm going to say that this particular invoice is to be divided into more than one category. So I'm just going to say truck rental as the description. Obviously I might embellish that. We'll pretend that we've got an invoice number here. And now I'm going to go to the general ledger expense account, which is lease rental equipment. And I'm going to hit repeat description. And then I'm going to say Davis shipment. And then I'm going to click New Item. Now it wants to allocate the whole amount of that purchase in this area, but I'm not going to do that. I'm going to say $700 in the debit column. If you look over here in the posting balance area, you can see it tells me what I need to do to get this transaction balanced. So I've got an incomplete allocation at this point. I've got $800 more that needs to be allocated. And the reason that I'm doing that is because I'm going to go to the commissions application, and I'm going to pick a vendor group, and I'm going to pick a driver, and then I'm going to make a different allocation And then now when I make a new item, what I'm doing is I'm creating an open liability item in a commission account for a commission driver or an independent contractor. So let's go ahead and click on that. And now let's take a look at what we've done. We have a $1,500 invoice payable to a vendor. We've taken $700 of it as an expense, as our expense, onto the general ledger, ultimately going to wind up on our income statement. And then we've taken the resulting $800 balance and we've applied it to a vendor's commission account, or excuse me, to a contractor's commission account, which then shows up as a negative item for him to be deducted from a future settlement. So this is an example of a vendor bill that's been split. There's other ways you can split bills. You can split them into different periods. You can split them into different expense allocations. You can spread an invoice over more than one contractor, or you can actually mix all of those possibilities together. Now there's a couple other things that can happen. I also can do a costing application, so I can tie the expense for a particular shipment. For instance, this Davis shipment, I could have done the job cost link and tied that back to a job, but that's a subject for another video. So I'm just going to go ahead and click Post as Payable, and it processes my transaction, says it's complete. If I want to bring up the journal history and look at the transaction that I made, I'll be able to do so. If I want to go into the payables list, or I want to run the general ledger, then that transaction's now committed to the GL and we're ready to move on. There are other functions that relate to this. The batch processing, the batch check processing function, the costing analysis, as I said, those are subjects for a different video, but these are the basics of how you enter a vendor bill. As always, if you've got any questions or you'd like a little more discussion about this, you're welcome to call our office, and we'll be happy to help you.